do this. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to again thank Dr. Gleb Sapersky for being with us today. And Gleb, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate it. Great. So let's talk about how to adapt and plan for the pandemic using neuroscience for business continuity professionals. So let's start by talking about how people actually responded. Prominent people, really important ones, people who often are in the position of actually hiring business continuity professionals like yourselves. People like Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk obviously is a huge entrepreneur, very important, a lot of business continuity professionals in his companies, and there are plenty of other leaders who listen to Elon Musk. He's very influential, very powerful. Now, how did he respond? Well, unfortunately, on March 6, 2020, this year, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And as you can see with his big Twitter following, he had a lot of people who liked and retweeted his tweet. Now, this was a tweet that was just a couple of weeks later after the declaration of the pandemic as a national emergency in the US. He tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, here we are. It's early June, and there's definitely been not 0 cases. We're over the 2 million mark. This is quite unfortunate, very wrong, very bad. And of course, it doesn't help him and the business continuity professionals working for him prepare well for the reality of the pandemic. So that's new money, Elon Musk, entrepreneur, Silicon Valley. Now, okay, maybe he got it wrong. What about old money, people who are really experts, super analytical, who hopefully know what they're talking about? Goldman Sachs, right? Their job is to provide good analysis for their money of business risks, including, of course, business continuity risks and risk management from a financial analysis perspective. Now, they made an estimate of US GDP growth in the second quarter. That's one of the things that they do. They make these estimates. On February 24th, they estimated that the GDP would be a growth of 2.7%. Now, this was in the context of a number of Italian cities already being on lockdown due to coronavirus. So this was lower than their previous estimate. They said, okay, it'll be only 2.7%. Now, what about March 15th? Well, 3 weeks later, so only 3 weeks later, they now said a 5% decline. That's a 7.7% difference. It's a huge difference, huge gap. Clearly, they were off the mark on February 24th. Well, what happened on March 20th? On March 20th, just 5 days later, after they said it would be a 5% decline, they now said it is going to be a 24% decline. Obviously, they screwed up. They screwed up pretty badly, and a lot of people in large companies, very influential people, listened to them, of course, and of course they made bad estimates about business continuity, risk management issues. As a result, the large majority, the vast majority of companies were greatly underprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic. They underestimated the threat, and they turned to their business continuity plans. And I run a company called Disaster Avoidance Experts. That's a 6-people training, consulting, coaching company in disaster avoidance, risk management, business continuity, strategic planning. So I made a lot of business continuity plans. I'm sure you have. Well, they are not a good fit for the situation. This is just not what business continuity plans are about. And I'm sure you understand why this is. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. They're great for actual emergencies. They're great for a blizzard or Houston getting flooded. Let's say that. That's a great situation, major flood. It's a 1 to 2 week interruption in your business. That's what a business continuity plan is for. It's for an emergency, but that's not what COVID-19 is. It's not an emergency. It's a major disruptor. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term disruptor. It's not an emergency. It's not something that we're used to. It's not something we're used to dealing with, which is why we're greatly underprepared for it. And relying on BCPs leads to a lot of problems for companies, for leaders. Talk about the facts about COVID-19 so we understand what it's about. Highly contagious. Every infected person infects many others, and as a result, the number of cases doubles every 3 to 6 days without any intervention. there's a risk of a serious illness where 10 to 20% get seriously ill. Now, you might have heard that something like anywhere from 40 to 50% might not exhibit symptoms. Of the rest, 30 to 40% exhibit moderate symptoms, just like a moderate case of the flu, slight symptoms, mild symptoms, sometimes that. And then 10 to 20% get seriously ill. Half of the seriously ill, 5 to 10%, need hospitalization. Now, of those, you're going to have 0.5 to 1% die. That's much worse than the flu, which is 0.1%. So there's a much higher death rate, of course, than 0.5 to 1% for those over 60 or with underlying health conditions. And we have no effective treatment. We have no effective treatment at all at this point, unfortunately. The remdesivir has been the only treatment that has been shown to be at least somewhat effective, and its main effect is reducing the length of hospital stay from an average of 15 days to 11 days, which is great, but not that helpful. Vaccine is our only solution. Now, human trials for a vaccine will need to test effectiveness and safety, and they're already ongoing. They started sometime in mid-March with the Moderna vaccine. You might have heard of that. But they will take at least a year, because you want to test safety of the vaccines, make sure that they don't have unacceptable side effects. And then you need to test effectiveness. Now, effectiveness has a number of stages. First, the effectiveness tests if the vaccine produces antibodies against COVID-19. But that is much less important than the second part of it. Do these antibodies, if they are indeed produced, are they actually effective in preventing infection with COVID-19? And that takes a long time, because you need to introduce the vaccine to a population which is susceptible to COVID-19 and then have them wait around until there's enough of them who might have gotten COVID-19. So that's why it takes at least a year, and that's if we throw all the money at it, which we are, and cut all the bureaucracy and red tapes, which we are, and make some ethical compromises, which we are. And usually it would take 4 to 5 years with a normal amount of money, normal amount of appropriate amount, let's say, of government red tape, regulations, and red tape is a negative word for regulations, which ensure safety and health and ethics. So the vaccine, you need to understand that most vaccines don't make it through human trials. This is especially a case for vaccines which are rushed into production, as pretty much all the first batch of vaccines on COVID-19 are. You might have heard of the first 8 to 10 vaccines, and they're of course rushed into production, which is not bad. They should be rushed into production, but there's a high chance that they won't make it through human trials because they were rushed into production. So it's unlikely that the first vaccines will be successful. Most likely we'll learn why the first batch of vaccines wasn't successful, so we can make a better second batch. And you need to realize that even after we have a vaccine, the government would need to coordinate its production, its distribution, and the vaccination of mass amounts of people. And there's unfortunately polls that show that only about 50% of the population is ready to take a vaccine because of anti-vaxxer sentiments. So that, getting people vaccinated is not nearly as easy as you might think it is. So that is something that we're facing. And the government has not shown a great deal of competence in the early stages of the pandemic. You might be quite aware of the paucity of testing. We don't have nearly enough tests for the population early on in the pandemic, and not even now. And of course, the personal protective equipment, and as well as ventilators, don't have nearly enough of the personal protective equipment, especially. That's a huge problem. So I'm not very confident about the ability of the government to do a great job with the production and distribution and vaccination. And you shouldn't be either. So let's talk about possible timelines. The optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one for vaccine. The optimistic one. The vaccine is approved for mass production by summer of 2021. We're assuming here that one of the first batches gets lucky. Something like if Moderna happens to be which is the first vaccine, incredibly unlikely to work just because of base rate probability of most vaccines not making it for human trials. It might be ready before summer of 2021. The other batch of early vaccines, you might have heard of the first 8 to 10, Johnson & Johnson, Gilead, and so on, if they would take some more time than Moderna, but it would be approved by summer of 2021. Then we're assuming a very extraordinarily high level of government competence, a level of competence as high as that of Australia or New Zealand, which have effectively prevented the virus, or South Korea, which, that has been very effective. The COVID-19 has been discovered in South Korea on the first day, on the same day as it was discovered in the US, and to date, only under 300 people died of COVID-19 in South Korea. So, of course, with the South Korean population being 60 million, the US is 330 million. So, by comparison, if we had the government response as good as South Korea's, we'd have only 1,500 people die as opposed to over 110,000 right now. So production, distribution, vaccination with that high level of government competence would take 6 months. And then most people will be vaccinated by early 2022. So that's very optimistic. That's incredibly optimistic. I'd say it's less than a 5% chance scenario, just because so many things would have to go right. Then the moderate scenario. This is much more likely. So this is the range where it will happen. It will be approved for mass production by 2023. That assumes anywhere from the end of 2022, the end of 2021 to the end of 2025, with a midpoint of 2023. Then production, distribution, vaccination, we're assuming a moderate level of government competence, somewhat higher than the government has shown so far. It will take a year instead of 6 months. And then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. So again, the midpoint for that would be combining those sometime between end of 2022 to end of 2026. And that's a 70% chance likelihood. So 70% chance probability of this. This is what will most likely happen. But, the universe can show us the middle finger, which would be the pessimistic timeline. So it might be much more difficult to produce a vaccine for COVID-19 than we think. And there are some indicators that it's an unusual disease. It's really been puzzling scientists. It has a number of secondary symptoms. So, for example, children have been dying of a rare inflammatory condition with COVID-19 that we don't know how to deal with exactly. So there are a number of other problems with COVID-19 that we're not aware of. And if it turns out to be more difficult to produce a vaccine for it, then it might be approved for mass production by 2026. Production, distribution, vaccination of 1 year, and then most people vaccinated by 2027. This is a 25% chance scenario. Again, this is pessimistic, but it's realistic. You might think it's too cynical, but you know what? We still don't have an effective vaccine for the flu. You might not know it, but our flu vaccine is only 50% effective, meaning that it reduces infections by 50%. So if we haven't found an effective vaccine for COVID-19, for the flu, we might not find one for COVID-19. So that's the timelines. Now, I'm going to ask you to do a poll. So if you look at your options, okay. So vote for the first poll, please. So the first poll only. Okay. So this might have been some difficulty with polling because I see that people weren't able to vote. So, okay, so we'll continue without the polls. But anyway, no worries about this. Sometimes technology fails us. So let's go on to the next one, after vaccine scenarios. Now, I want to share that this is not easy to hear. This is difficult information. I had a lot of difficulty with it when I first learned about it as an expert, learning about this COVID-19 as a risk management, disaster preparedness, continuity expert. This was hard for me to hear, hard for me to learn, hard for me to accept. So I still struggle with this information, and so do my clients. They find it difficult to accept this information. I have to sometimes drag them kicking and screaming into accepting the information. But you have to realize that it will be more painful. What I tell them and what helps them accept it, the leaders and organizations for which I consult, is that it will be more painful if we don't accept it. And we need to adapt to this major disruption now before more pain is caused. So suppression is our only option, just realistically. This is our only option that we have, at least for non-authoritarian societies now. Unlike China, we can't put locks on people's doors. So shutdowns and social distancing will be the strategies we need to take in order to avoid overwhelming hospitals, because in that case, the death rate shoots up by an order of magnitude. Everyone who would go to the hospitals now would now die. So instead of 0.5 to 1%, it gets to be 5 to 10%. And it's extremely costly. We know this. We know that these economic shutdowns are extremely costly, but we also know it's effective. That's what has been effective in flattening the curve in a number of states. And several countries, we know, reduced their number of COVID-19 for aggressive suppression, but what we've also seen is that when governments started lifting restrictions, then COVID-19 cases have spiked. So this is also part of the reality of the situation. And they were forced to bring back restrictions. Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, this is the case all over. And what we can anticipate based on this, our future until widespread vaccination, will have looser restrictions, which we're having right now in a number of states, followed by an increase in cases, which we're also having in a number of states. And then there will be tighter restrictions. Now, that has not yet happened in some states, but what has happened in Arizona, for example, so if any of you are coming from Arizona, you might know that the emergency medical plans for hospitals were activated because they're coming close to being overwhelmed in the near future based on an uptick of cases. If the uptick continues, then the government, I think, will be forced to shut down certain areas of Arizona, and then there will be a decrease in cases. And that's what we're facing, these repeating waves of social distancing shutdowns until vaccine is widely available. This is not a short-term emergency, it's a major disruption. And even in the most optimistic scenario, vaccine won't be widely available until 2022. The world in this context will change forever, and we have to realize this. It's not easy but it will change forever. There will be waves of restrictions, and they'll change people's habits, norms, values, expectations. We'll never go back to what we're used to of January 2020. And think about your role. You're a trusted advisor, you're a business continuity professional, you're a risk management professional. Your role is to empower the leaders of your organizations to realize the extent of the major disruption that we're facing. Most are way too optimistic, and you need to help them prepare for this unfortunate reality. By conveying this information effectively, you'll help them accomplish both their leadership goals and reinforce their trust in you as a trusted advisor. So this is what you need to do. Help them understand that by accepting and adapting to this information, they will accomplish their leadership goals. And that will be good for them, and it will be good for you that you will reinforce your role as a trusted advisor. You want to not plan for the optimistic scenario. There are too many companies planning for this, so the problems will blow over soon. But this is a phrase I'm sure you're familiar with, and that you can use with your leaders. Hope is not a strategy, attributed to Vince Lombardi, famous coach. So it's good for business leaders who are into sports. You want to prepare for moderate or pessimistic scenarios instead. The pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and here we need to understand how we make decisions and manage risks. We're really bad about making decisions about such slow-moving threats, unusual threats, because of how our brain is wired, just because of the way we think. Our gut reaction, our intuition, people overwhelmingly go with their guts when responding to threats, is to underestimate such threats and then endanger their businesses. So here is the context in which I come in. My expertise is in cognitive neuroscience and decision making. Let me talk a little bit about my experience so that you understand where I'm coming from. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, I mentioned that already. It's a consulting, coaching, and training company, and we focus on disaster avoidance, so not simply crisis management, but disaster avoidance itself, and managing risks, decision making, and strategic planning. I also spent 15 years in academia as such, studying cognitive neuroscience, the way our brain works, and behavioral economics, how we behave in economic situations because of how our brain works. I published in a number of prominent journals like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, a bunch of other peer-reviewed venues, so I have the academic credibility to speak about this. I worked with a whole bunch of clients, from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies, from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zappos, give me a call. Then media. I've appeared in a wide variety of prominent media: Inc., Fast Company, Scientific American, CBS News, Time, CNBC, NPR, Newsweek, a lot of these venues, as well as specific risk management venues such as Quality Digest, Risk Management Journal, and so on. And I published a number of best-selling books. My best-known one is Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. So if you want to read only one and recommend only one to others, that's the one I would recommend. The Blind Spots Between Us: How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. That focuses on how to influence other people effectively through cultivating good relationships with them, not through manipulation and something like that, but for cultivating good relationships with them, making sure that your relationships are as good as they can be in both professional and personal settings. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, talks about how to realize uncomfortable truths and helps others accept them. And finally, my newest one, just published, literally, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic, with Changemakers Books. So these are all books that are published by traditionally published venues. And this book, of course, talks about the topic of this presentation. This presentation is based on it. So if you want to know more about the sources, the research on all of this, go to the book. I want to talk about why bad advice is common, about how to make good decisions. It comes from dangerous judgment errors that are called cognitive biases, that come from a combination of our evolutionary background and our brain wiring. Now, our primary response to threats is the fight or flight response. Talked about our response to threats, that gut reaction. It was great for those for hunter-gatherers because the risks they faced were immediate, intense, in the moment. You might have heard of it as the saber-toothed tiger response, when we had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Well, unfortunately, we have many less saber-toothed tigers, or fortunately, in the modern environment, but we still use the fight or flight response to respond to threats. But the risks we face are very different. They're long-term, they're uncertain, much more likely to come from notifications on our phone about some kind of weird disease developing in somewhere in the middle of China, in Wuhan, China, that we see in some back deeply buried article in some news story somewhere. And it's very hard for us to appreciate how much that can impact our lives. And that is a big problem for us. And we suffer specifically from three dangerous judgment errors: the normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting, that are very relevant to COVID-19. The normalcy bias. Now, we look at the future and we feel like the future will be much like today. That's our feeling, that's our gut reaction, that's our intuition. It was a safe assumption in the savannah environment, but it's not a safe assumption in the modern world because things will not necessarily go normally. We have many more disruptors, whether coming from technology or the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009, human caused, or of course this pandemic, which is naturally caused but human spread. Our world is very interconnected, and that is a big problem that we don't realize and we don't think about, that Wuhan, in China, has something like 500 international flights a day. And so it's carrying something like an average of 10,000 people, if you average 200 people on a flight, to all over the world, spreading this disease. It's pretty dangerous. And this leads us to forecast short-term future based on the short-term past. I'm sure you've seen this in your business continuity and risk management work, where the result is underestimating the likelihood and the impact of major disruption. The planning fallacy. We are very confident about our plans, way too confident. We think the future will go according to our plans. We like our plans, and we don't build in risks and contingencies and problems into our plans. And we underestimate the resources we need of time, money, information, social capital, and so on, as so many people did in their business continuity plans and in general in planning, in their strategic plans, dealing with the future of their companies, organizations, and their careers in the context of COVID-19. Well, before COVID-19, not anticipating the possibility of something like this. And finally, hyperbolic discounting. We perceive the short-term future as really more important than the long-term future, and we harm ourselves in the long term. We are gathering pennies in front of a bulldozer. We take very bad short-term risks for really for long-term risks for very small short-term rewards. And so we prioritize short-term to the detriment of the long-term. And so many people are doing this right now who are rushing to reopen in the context of the pandemic. We underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of our actions. So these are the cognitive biases that you need to be aware of, and you as a trusted advisor need to help your companies overcome. You need to go against your intuitions, and you need to help the leaders you serve do so. Our intuitions evolved to help early humans survive, but they're not great for making decisions in the modern world. You know this from other areas, from let's say your diet. It's very tempting to eat donuts, those sugary, delicious donuts. Those are very tempting. And in the savannah environment, that was the right decision to have as much sugar as possible, because when you came across honey, apples, bananas, you need to eat as much as possible in order to survive and thrive and reproduce in that environment. So we're the descendants of those who have very good fight or flight responses and who are very strongly triggered by sugar. In the modern environment, we have way too much sugar for our own good. So it's a bad idea to be so triggered by sugar. It's a bad idea to actually start eating donuts, and then it's very hard to stop. So instead, it would be much healthier to orient toward eating a healthy bowl of fruit, but it looks much less appetizing and it's much less triggering than those donuts. How can you prepare? You need to make long-term changes to your plans, just like you make long-term changes to your diet, to your eating habits, in order to adapt well to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Think years, not weeks. So you need to make fundamental changes to your business model. And if you're not working in a business, to your organizational model, to your career, for a future focused on virtual interactions, because there'll be many more virtual interactions than we think right now, with so many businesses rushing to reopen and not thinking about the next wave of restrictions and closures. I strongly am encouraging my clients, pushing them, kicking and screaming, to make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings. And a good way of doing so is ending your real estate lease. I mean, at the very least, minimize the footprint, but ideally end it all, go to virtual teams. It's very doable. If you need to meet, you can always use co-working spaces. It's definitely doable. I strongly recommend this. It's been very helpful for a number of clients of mine. You want to think about, as you're changing to virtual teams, virtual collaboration, your internal business model and your external business model. 6 areas in your internal business model to think about. Let's start with internal controls. You want to ensure financial security. That's a major area of internal controls, of course. So think about how you'll do that. Ensuring financial security, addressing that. Then, as related to it and distinct from it, is preventing cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The FBI is reporting a lot more hacking going on with people working from home, partially because people aren't used to following cybersecurity protocols at home, and partially because they don't have their hardware and software are not as hardened as they would be at work. So this is something to address. Then adapting existing compliance practices. So whatever compliance practices existed for the office, you need to adapt them for the home environment. And you need to pursue compliance with CDC guidelines if you're going to be meeting in the office and co-working, whatever. So think about doing that. And finally, revise your internal measurements. It's something people don't take nearly seriously enough. They have their internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency, but those need to be adapted for the home environment, and they don't do nearly enough of a good job on that. Motivation engagement. Why is this relevant? Well, before the pandemic, only 34% of all employees were fully engaged according to Gallup surveys. They were innovative, creative, ready to sacrifice for the team, and the vast majority, way over 50%, are disengaged, somewhat disengaged or passive, coming in, just doing barely enough to get by, not get fired. They're not very with it. And over 10% are actively hostile, bad-mouthing the company to others, ready to steal from it, and if they have the opportunity, trying to find a new position. Now, in working from home, there's an initial wave of emergency and so on, but people can't go on emergency for too long. So there's going to be a lack of motivation from that tribal environment, from being around other employees. It's a very important aspect of motivation. And of course, there's going to be the stress, the hassle of adjusting to a personal life, kids at home and so on. So this is where you need to provide support and guidance to employees. Now, this is not your direct function as a risk management professional, but this is where you come in as a trusted advisor and tell your leadership, your higher-ups, that this is an important area for them to consider in terms of risk, the employee motivation engagement. not simply internal controls. This is why I'm talking about a number of areas. You want to help them as a trusted advisor manage the risks for a number of areas. Another one is effective communication. Now, virtual communication is very different from the in-office communication. When you're communicating in virtual teams, the large majority of communication shifts to text only. So people who are used to in-office communication, they miss out on so many cues of facial expression, body language, tone of voice. When I say, I think Mary should take that project, or I say, I think Mary should take that project, those are two very different sentences. They mean very different things. But when I write them out, they mean the same thing. So this is some situation that breeds miscommunication. This is very risky. This is something that people can get training in, fortunately. This is a matter of professional development. And so you need to highlight this to your leaders, that this is something that they need to get professional development in, or your clients if you're an independent consultant and serving your clients. Cultivating trust, a related but distinct area. Face-to-face interactions, resolving conflicts, the related but distinct area. Face-to-face interactions, very natural way of resolving conflicts because you can see each other, you can empathize with each other, hear each other's tone of voice. They allow us to notice and resolve problems. But of course, you don't have that in a virtual environment. It's harder to notice problems because you don't see those emotional subtexts and cues, and it's harder to resolve them because of difficulties in communication. So this is another area for training. So professional development, training in resolving conflicts, distinct from and related to effective communication. Cultivating trust. This is really important. People tend to really underestimate how we cultivate trust in a team and office settings when we talk about what your kids are doing, your local sports ball team, how here in Columbus, Ohio, go Bucks, and so on. And of course, all of these sorts of things which make us human to each other, the office cooler conversation. In virtual settings, it doesn't happen naturally. So you need to cultivate that. You need to create an environment where that happens. This is something that you create a venue for. Finally, accountability. In the office, it's much easier to hold people accountable. You walk around, you chat with people, you see as a supervisor who's doing what, who is disengaged, check in with them, and so on. And of course, with your colleagues, you can pop over into Bob's office and say, hey, Bob, where's that report you were promising me yesterday? Now, that's going to be much harder for Bob to ignore than a Slack message that you send about the report. So new structures must be created to ensure accountability, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. This is accountability up the chain of command and peer-to-peer accountability, both those forms of accountability. Next, your external business model. Think about changing that as well. There are 6 areas that you need to change in the external business model, starting with service delivery, which this is kind of obvious, but you want to be thinking about then being creative in transitioning to virtual, socially distanced settings. Some will find it easier than others. So, if product sales, you shift all virtual, right? Much easier to do. If you are a media company, then there's a lot of virtual activities that you can be doing, information provision, technology, and so on, very easy. For me, where I do a lot of in-person training, consulting, coaching, it's been pretty difficult. My company, Disaster Avoidance Experts, the large majority of our money comes from in-person activities. So this is something that has been quite a challenge to transition to virtual settings, doing virtual presentations like this one, of course, and this is a webinar, so keynote style trainings, which are 3 hours to a day sort of presentations, facilitated retreats of various sorts virtually, consulting, coaching, that's quite a bit harder to do. So this has been definitely a challenge and a struggle for me personally, for my company. And I know for a number of my clients, I work a lot with manufacturing and so on, with finance. They have had some finance less, manufacturing more, but they have had trouble adapting to a new situation as well. So you want to be creative and figure out how you can be of service to others. Some businesses, the best choice may be to close. I'll be honest. The restaurants are not going to do well in the near future. This is not a good business to be in. If you can, get out of this business. In fact, I helped a client transition from serving as the CEO of a chain of Midwestern restaurants to a coaching client to instead working as the regional manager in a national chain of grocery stores. So this has obviously moved down the career ladder. but it's important to be accepting of that when you move industries, and there's a lot of growth potential for her. Relationships. This is an important one. You need to learn how to cultivate relationships effectively virtually, both establishing new ones and cultivating existing ones. This is not going to be easy if you're used to those pat on the back, smile, shake hands, which I'm used to, of course, in-person networking. This is going to be important for clients and prospects, service providers, political leaders who are, of course, providing a lot of funding right now. And that's going to be important to think about the government relations, investors, suppliers. And this is an area of professional development. This is definitely something you can improve in. Managing disruptions. You are watching this presentation, and hopefully that you will be implementing these steps. So that will help you be more protected, be more failure-proof, pandemic-proof in this context. But you will not be able to convince all of your external stakeholders to be pandemic-proof. And your leaders who will be interacting with external stakeholders who you need to support in this context, they won't be able to convince those external stakeholders either. So what you need to do is help your leaders, your clients. You need to help them protect themselves from the long-term disruptions of the pandemic, from their external stakeholders who won't do so. So make plans to protect yourself from their failures. Shifting norms. So think about the norms. I already mentioned this briefly, but here is the planning, thinking about this. After several years of restrictions and loosenings, even if it's only until early 2022, which is very unlikely, then we will have different norms, wants, desires, habits, expectations. You want to anticipate and get ahead of these shifts. This is something that you really want to be thinking about. How can you be in the position where people will need you most? Unknown unknowns. Now, the pandemic was a predictable disaster. So low probability, high impact, slow-moving train wreck. We don't do well in anticipating this, so a lot of people were shocked. But it's a predictable disaster. A number of people like Bill Gates were warning about it for a long time. And you can scan your environment for potential major disasters like the pandemic and be able to predict it more and help your leaders do so and protect yourself against them. There are many ways of doing so. For example, business continuity plans can be made to not simply be for emergencies, but also for long-term major disruptions. Not everything can be predicted, of course, so you want to reserve some cash cushion for protection. I strongly recommend that. And finally, outcompete your competition. This will be the part that the leaders you serve, your clients, will find their favorite part. This has been inevitably favorite part of my clients. Steps I shared. So if you implement them, and if you actually take the steps to be pandemic-proof, they'll help you gain a major competitive advantage, or the clients you serve. At a time when many will fail to adapt to the pandemic, you will go ahead, and this is an opportunity to get ahead of competitors, seizing market share, hiring away good employees, and so on. So let's think about the plan. How can you actually plan for this future of the pandemic? 6 steps again that I want to highlight in planning for the future of the pandemic. First, think about the possible futures and plan for a variety of them, and invest your resources according to your plans for each one. I talked about the optimistic scenario, vaccine by 2022, and widely available, distributed, most people vaccinated by 2022. Up moderate one by 2024, up pessimistic one by 2027. These are the basics of how you should plan. So at least plan for these, and of course adapt it to your needs, to your context. Then think about 5 years out. Where will you be? Where will your business be? Where will your leaders be? Where will your clients be in 5 years? In each of these scenarios, the optimistic, the moderate, and the pessimistic. Think about the problems that you'll experience in each of these scenarios. What are the challenges? What are the issues that you'll have? And think of ways of addressing them in advance. So for example, if you're not currently great at cultivating relationships effectively with external stakeholders virtually, which not too many people are, given that we've not been anticipating the pandemic, this is fortunate. There's fortunately an easy fix. There's a lot of good professional development, and you can contact me. I know some resources about how to improve your ability to cultivate external relationships. Or you can make a plan to resolve them if they do occur. So certain ones, again, these virtual relationships you can predict, certain ones you can plan for. opportunities. Think about opportunities that might come your way. And in each of these scenarios, as I mentioned, and how you can bring them about. So for example, if you want to seize market share from your competitors, something that you can do right now is make a plan to be pandemic proof and think about the steps that you'll take to be pandemic proof and start implementing them. Then, as you do so, you can approach prospects who are currently working with competitors, and or you can tell your leaders, your sales team, that this is something they can do. They can write up specific talking points and say, hey Mr. Prospect, or hey Miss Prospect, we have taken, I know you're working with my competitor, and that's great, but you should know that we've taken these steps A through F to be pandemic proof. And if our competitor who has not taken these steps happens to stumble, if the pandemic turns out to be worse than our very, very optimistic predictions and hopes, then you can consider turning to me. And I can guarantee to you that they will remember you when the time comes and they will give you a call. Resources. Think about the resources you'll need in each of these scenarios. So money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning, of course, take the time to do so in advance. And you want to make a plan to reserve sufficient ones for the pessimistic scenario. This is what I'm pressing on all of my clients. This is something I'm going to strongly recommend to you. Not all of them are able. So some of the innovative startups with which I'm working, they just don't have the resources for the pessimistic scenario. So they're preparing for the moderate scenario instead, knowing that they're taking a pretty big risk of 25% the downside, but they are preparing at least for the moderate scenario, whereas the large majority of people are preparing for the optimistic one. You don't want to plan for this. You want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. So hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And think about the information that you'd need to see which one of these scenarios is actually coming into being. What information would tell you whether we're in the optimistic world, the moderate world, or the pessimistic one. Monitor this information closely and adjust your plans according to which world it seems like we're living in. And then execute, execute, execute. All right, folks. Additional resources you'll get by email from me as the presenter. There's an option of a free coaching session with me and 2 chapters from my forthcoming book. Well, it's now out. Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. At this point, I'll be happy to take questions.
Gleb, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, great presentation. So many perspectives that people like me, been in the business a long time, and haven't really looked at things quite that way. Let me get into the questions. The person wrote, this question is more about planning in general. Should we formulate business continuity plans in a general way for a major disruption, or should we attempt to plan for each type of possible major disruption, a pandemic, a flood, a hazmat incident, and so forth?
What you would want to do is you would want to deal with what you're dealing with currently. Of course, COVID-19, you'd want to address that, plan for that. Then you'd want to make a general plan for various other sorts of disasters that we've just been discussing. So all of these sorts of disasters, hazmat, and so on. And then to the extent that you have resources available for strategic planning, you'd want to plan for other scenarios. So that depends on your resources. Ideally, you'd plan for each of these realistic scenarios that depend on your context and your industry. Obviously, if you're working in chemicals, you definitely want to be prepared for a hazmat scenario. So things like this. If you're working in let's say a finance company, definitely want to be prepared for a cybersecurity breach, because you're going to be targeted more if you're a finance wealth management company, something like that. So depending on your industry, and then expand out from there. Whatever resources you have available for strategic planning, that depends on your capacity. But the more strategic planning you can do, the more you can turn to a plan when you have a situation that comes into being, as opposed to running around like a chicken without your head, as so many people have been doing with COVID-19. I mean, there's a reason so many people have been making bad decisions around COVID-19, because they don't have a good plan. They only have a business continuity plan for a 1 to 2 week interruption, which is no good.
Great, thank you. How do we deal with civil unrest at the same time as pandemic?
So this is a really important dynamic where we're talking about unknown unknowns. Obviously, who could have easily predicted that something like the situation with civil unrest could occur. So what you want to do with civil unrest is respect the reality of the situation and of course acknowledge the concerns that are happening within your company with diversity and inclusion issues. That's very important to acknowledge. So D&I issues, what's going on. In terms of civil unrest that's happening outside the external context of your company, this is an especially important reason to be more oriented toward virtual teams, virtual collaboration, virtual communication. You get much more bang for the buck. Now, you don't simply protect yourself from COVID-19, but you also protect yourself from civil unrest. You also protect yourself from flooding. You also protect yourself from various other incidents that you can protect yourself from. So this is something that's a really beneficial strategy from a number of perspectives. So that's what I would strongly encourage. This is why virtual communication, virtual interactions is especially helpful. And the rush back to reopen the office is especially unhelpful.
Okay. Maybe along the same lines, what advice would you give to people who are in a university setting where showing up is part of the educational process?
A lot of universities are doing the smart thing. So, for example, the University of California system has canceled all in-person classes for the fall semester, and they have done all virtual classes. So that's something I strongly recommend my university clients that I'm talking to. And I understand that they're not always in the position to influence the full dynamics of what's going on. And of course, there's financial issues to be considered, various stakeholders. But to the extent they can shift classes to virtual settings, that's something I strongly recommend. And you want to realize that a lot of the students will not want to come back to campus. They already liked virtual settings and they enjoyed that. So there will be less of a demand for in-person classes than many people think. Then this is something that we're clearly seeing. Something that will help financially for universities is to let go of a number of real estate investments that they've made based on the desire to have more of a footprint. So selling that space, this is definitely a good time to sell commercial real estate because it's not that many people have realized how badly off commercial real estate will be in the future. So that is something that you want to be thinking about. Of course, there are some things that you can't control in terms of showing up, and you may not be the final decision maker. To the extent that you want to manage risks, of course, you want to follow CDC guidelines. That's part of it. But the CDC guidelines are unfortunately, well, let's just say there's certain political pressures on the CDC which make their guidelines problematic. So, for example, the 6 feet guidelines, that's no good at all. We know that water droplets travel when that's the lowest bounds on which water droplets travel. You want to do at least 10 feet social distancing, and then as much as possible have classes outside, have interactions outside. We know that compared to our early impressions of COVID-19, we know that interactions outside are less risky than we initially thought, than epidemiologists initially thought, and that interactions inside are actually more risky, partially because if someone has COVID-19 and they're spending a lot of time in a space, it doesn't matter if you're 10 feet, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet away. Eventually, if they're spending enough time in the space, their air that they've breathed will circulate throughout the space and will reach you. So there's a lot of going to be what universities will be dealing with, and I'll be happy to bet a lot of money on this, is that they will be surprised by how many infections there are in closed spaces. So let's say a lecture hall and so on, where somebody spends, let's 1 hour lecture, and then their breath goes around to a number of students, and then they have an infection and they need to close down the building in which they are for a deep cleaning that causes a lot of disruption, causes a lot of stress, causes a lot of hassle. There's going to be a lot of stress, a lot of problems. So as much as possible, I'm recommending my university clients to do teaching outside, do various interactions outside as weather permits, of course.
And certainly, I'm sure you agree that the schools that have been doing online instruction for a long time have an advantage over the ones that haven't, because it isn't something that you just flip the switch. It's something that you have to get good at. you
You
know?
do, and this is about learning the best practices. This is something where you can get professional development, of course. We
Yeah.
talked about in each of these areas, so virtual communication, virtual problem solving, virtual relationship building, virtual education, virtual presentation, right? I'm presenting virtually. This is a skill which you can improve. So there's professional development that you can get in a lot of these areas. And the summer right now is actually a good time to do quite a lot of professional development.
Yep. Yep. Agree. Thank you. How do you, one of the things you do when you plan is you try to predict what you're planning for. And one of the things, if we learn nothing from this pandemic, and pandemics happen and they're not predictable as to when they'll happen, but their frequency is predictable. They've happened over and over again for a long, long time. So rational behavior is not expected. So everybody was surprised by toilet paper hoarding, and I don't know, was chicken or meat or all the different things that have been cleaned out on the shelves. And it varies. It's kind of interesting to go to the grocery store, even if you don't need anything, not to put yourself at risk, but to see where the empty shelves are, because it moves around the store.
Yeah.
And now when you walk in, the front of the store have skids stockpiled of toilet paper and paper towels and so forth, as if to send a message that there's no shortage, but don't stock up on it, right? No need to hoard. But how do you deal with that type of behavior? It's irrational. By definition, you can't predict irrational behavior to some extent.
Talked about the normalcy bias. So what you want to do and the fight or flight response, what you want to understand is that the behavior that seems to us rational, it's simply motivated by a revolutionary psychology. It's not irrational from the evolutionary psychology perspective, from the savannah perspective. We have the defensive response and the aggressive response. The defensive response, those will be the two major ways that people will react. They'll react way too quickly. They will jump to conclusions, and the saber-toothed tiger response, jump first, and then either defend or attack. The defensive response or the aggressive response, the fight or the flight. So the flight in this case was people who were ignoring the pandemic, and still so many people are. People aren't wearing masks. People are just saying that it's a hoax. It's no better, worse than common cold. All of these sorts of things. People who are basically ignoring the pandemic, saying it's not a big deal. People shouldn't be making a big deal out of it. That's fleeing from the information. They're ignoring the reality of the situation. And then there's the fight response. People who are trying to get control of the situation. They're trying to figure out how they can fight the situation. I mean, it just happened to be the case that for households, getting toilet paper, which is a way to get yourself clean, a way to protect yourself, and of course, not simply toilet paper, but other cleaning ingredients, but toilet paper was in particular shortage just because of how our supply structure works. So Lysol, hand sanitizer, all of that was in shortage. All of these cleaning supplies will be in shortage. People will be grabbing them up to protect themselves and to try to get control over the situation. And you've seen a lot of business leaders do the same sort of things, try to get control of the situation. So some of them, indeed, like Elon Musk, were fleeing from the information and ignoring it and saying, yeah, la, 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 not happening, right? Sticking their fingers in their ears. But others are trying to get control, trying to figure out, get control. And right now they're trying to get back to normal, falling into the normalcy bias, because we really want to get back to normal. It's very natural and intuitive to want to get back to normal. But it's not a good response at all. It's really harmful and dangerous to try to get back to normal. So you can actually predict what will happen. People will try to have some kind of fight response, and other people will have the flight response, defensive or aggressive, immediate, too quick, not gathering enough information before jumping into either response. And then as soon as they can, they'll try to get back to life as normal because they're missing it and they want that again. So you can see this dynamic play out again and again in pandemics and other sorts of situations. And this is something that you can prepare for and predict if you understand cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors. So that's what I wrote that's why that book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. I highlighted that as the one thing that you want to read for a broader framework, because that tells us about how we're screwed up, how our brain is screwed up because of our evolutionary heritage and just the way that we're wired. the kind of mistakes we'll tend to make, and how you can manage these risks and help those you work with and people in your families, people in your communities make the best decisions possible.
Great perspective. Last question as we come towards the top of the hour. Organizations like ACP are basically networks for sharing best practices for business continuity planning. We don't want to ever stop doing that. And we've always said that nobody competes on the basis of preparedness. And being prepared is different than preparedness. In other words, we sell insurance as business continuity professionals, and whether our higher ups buy it or not is another story. But in fact, when we come up with an idea for doing something better, a better way to drill or a better way to plan, we tend to share those things and they become best practices. And that's the basis of that networking. Just to be clear, the advantage that businesses gain by being better prepared isn't about not sharing that knowledge. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. So you are not trying to not share that knowledge. It's not your goal. You want to share it with other business continuity professionals because the people in your network, I mean, they will appreciate you sharing this, and then you will be stronger together as part of your network. You always want your network to be stronger together because these are your allies, your supporters, and they gain when you gain and you gain when they gain. So this is a really powerful dynamic. Of course, you will also keep some corporate secrets. That is not something for you to share, especially, of course, with your competitors. So your competitors, and I'm talking about the competitors for your business, whatever your business you're in, you don't want to share corporate secrets with your competitors. And those are the things that I'm talking about. How are you specifically preparing? What are you doing to get prepared? How are you making yourself pandemic proof? What are your strategies to do so? Those are not things that you share with your immediate competitors. And that is something that I'm sure you recognize, that your leaders recognize. That's your competitive advantage. So here is where you want to make sure that your competitive advantage, you use it to inform your leaders, and your leaders will be really grateful to you. This is something that they really like to do. They like to outcompete the competition. They like to seize market share. They like to know that they can get resources like hiring away good employees. That will help position you as a trusted advisor in their eyes. So that's kind of toward the leaders who you serve, your clients if you're an independent professional, and at the same time, your network of professionals, you want to share these best practices in principle as opposed to the specific strategies of your company. Those best practices in principle make them stronger together and uplift you as part of your network.
Maybe one of the best webinars I've been part of in terms of getting a different way to think about things. So thank you so much, Gleb. Very, very well presented and certainly well received.
Thank you.
Folks will get a survey. Please do fill out the survey or provide us your feedback in any way that you feel is appropriate. So on behalf of ACP, once again, Gleb, thank you.
Thank you.
Our webinar schedule is on the website. It's been updated.